Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Let's see, someone needs to mute themselves because we're getting a lot of background noise. I want to welcome several folks here who I recognize from earlier webinars. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our revenue-generating in-person events and now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today, we are going to be looking at some of the significant changes occurring in higher education. In a sense, this is a continuation of some of the discussion we had at last week's webinar with David Schweikert, who I see has joined us again today. So we'll be looking at ideological hegemony and higher education, ideas as material forces. We have two speakers, both of whom have been based at Purdue University, one university that has been affected by the changes that we will be talking about. Harry Targ, who will be speaking first, is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at Purdue, and is co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. Our second speaker, Dan Morris, is a literary scholar and poet who will examine the views of Michael Crow, president of Arizona State University, who is shaping his university along the lines promoted by the Koch brothers. And we have with us also Patricia Huntington, who is on the faculty of Arizona State University. So I'm looking forward to a rich discussion. And without any further delay, let me hand the floor over to Harry Targ, who will start off, followed by Dan. And then after that, we'll have questions and discussions. Okay, Harry, unmute yourself.
Okay, am I?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. I was telling Cliff, I'm just so proud of these images. I've played with putting pictures on PowerPoint, so I think this one is really cool. Thank you so much for attending. I'm going to talk generally about elements of what I call the crisis of higher education, and Dan is going to address more specifically some of the ideological precepts of new thinking about higher education with a particular application to Purdue University. First, changes seem to be occurring almost on a daily basis. So the quote I'm going to show you momentarily isn't somewhat outdated already. One, for example, there was an announcement by some neoconservatives that they're launching a new university project in Austin, Texas called Austin University. And to use the language that we often use about academic freedom, they're arguing that this new Austin University will provide, for the first time in a long time, academic freedom. And such scholars as Neil Ferguson and Steven Pinker are part of this project. Secondly, not unconnected, we know that there have been at least 47 bills introduced in 22 states that in some ways are designed to regulate the curricula in either K-12 and or higher education. The state of Iowa has a bill that requires that universities not have course material that has, quote, divisive concepts. Third, and today we read that a professor of law at Indiana University was being investigated for his own research on the search process for the selection of a new president of Indiana University. And so that he's been, in a sense, the target of investigation for his own investigative work. If we look at, let's see if I can, how do I get to the next slide? Okay. I developed this interest and concern about Purdue, as did Dan, in that we saw the changes going on at Purdue University as particularly troubling, given our conception of higher education, both in terms of process, policy making, and educational content. Initially, I naively assumed that what concerned me about Purdue University was perhaps unique to our situation in North Central Indiana. But as I and we began to read, we realized that the changes that were in process at Purdue University and the people who were advocating these changes were doing so all across the country. And the more we delved into the literature, the more we saw that what we thought was a unique situation at Purdue has been written about extensively, such that there are libraries of books on the issue of the transformation of higher education. And then I asked myself, well, why concentrate on higher education? There's appropriate concern for global warming, the military-industrial complex, growing economic inequality, blatant racism all across the US and the face of the globe. What's relevant about higher education? So I did modest Google research, that is 21st century research, to just see what the magnitude of the role of higher education is in American society. And here are some factoids that give us some sense of the magnitude of higher education as an institution in American society. Almost 4,000 degree-granting post-secondary institutions are in the United States. Approximately 20 million college students were enrolled in 2019, about 15 million in public colleges and universities, and 5 million in private colleges and universities. An enormous amount of money invested in research and development in universities. And if you look at the last item alone, the United States invested 2.6% of its GDP in higher education in 1917. And as of 1919, military expenditures amounted to 3.4% of the US gross domestic product. So just in terms of economics, higher education plays a sizable role in the very nature of the US political economy. And while it doesn't reach the apex of military spending, it constitutes a significant force in American society. I would add, in addition, the proposition that I think David Schweikert suggested last time, that higher education is just one of many institutions, a microcosm, if you will, of the kind of institutional and policy changes that are occurring in American society in general. This is the quote that I started a prior lecture with that is, in a sense, been updated by newer events. The assault on academic freedom and autonomy by right-wing political forces has been escalating in recent months. Say in North Carolina, in a major donor in the tenure case of Nicole Hannah Jones recommended against her getting tenure. Vaccination and mask mandates have been suppressed at colleges in red states around the country. Presidential searches at places like University of South Carolina and elsewhere were hijacked to insert political allies of governing boards. And now we see that that might be the case in Indiana University. Recent events at the University of Florida have raised these problems to a new level. Remember, the president of the University of Florida tried to prohibit faculty whose expertise is in gerrymandering and other electoral issues from testifying before state legislative committees. So that we see in all different forms efforts to constrain, shape both the personnel and the subject matter of education in institutions of higher education. When Dan and I started, we began to talk about and ruminate over a whole variety of issues that made us uncomfortable about the changes going on at Purdue University. And I made a list of some of these concerns that we talked about over coffee and bagels. The nature and purposes of 21st century higher education. What's its purpose? What should be its substance? The workforce is necessary to achieve the goals of the university. Of course, we are very much concerned with adjunctification and the reduction of any kind of employment security by faculty. How decisions involving education are made, and there are also a whole panoply of decisions made at Purdue University that have been almost totally non-transparent. Funding higher education, the issue of metrics, the shift from education that has a strong humanist and social science component to STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and following along that, significant institutional changes. There's a small college in Indianapolis that I just heard a few days ago that announced it was abolishing its political science program. So these issues have concerned us significantly. And in addition, what's the connection between so-called elite universities, R1 universities, public universities, and four-year colleges and community colleges? So these are some of the variety of issues that concerns us. I discovered recently that much of this has been categorized under the rubric of critical university studies. And I like that designation, and I decided that I'm doing research on critical university studies. And to ask myself, well, what does critical university studies for me mean to me? And how do we sort of concretize and organize the range of problems that I listed in the last slide. And I decided on three broad categories of critical university studies that should concern us and that we are doing research on. One, the political economy of capitalism and the connections of the university to the larger capitalist political economy, and the connections between the larger political economy and the universities itself. Of course, the connection between corporations and the military. And I've been particularly concerned with Purdue University's increased collaboration with military-driven corporations like Saab and the Department of Defense. And Purdue has embarked upon a program to develop aircraft for 21st century cyberspace warfare. And it has used as its rationale the need to apply Purdue's research capabilities to prepare for the Chinese threat. So Purdue has moved in a significant direction in trying to curry the favor of military-based corporations in the Department of Defense. Political economy of capitalism and the connections with higher education also involves the question of privatization, public-private programs, and increasing contracting with private corporations for engaging in services that traditionally were done by university employees and experts in education. In addition, I've been concerned from the Purdue experience with the idea of the university, and in this case, again, Purdue University, engaging in significant amounts of real estate development and investment in conjunction with private realtors. And recently I read Devarian Baldwin's book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, where he does about a half dozen case studies of urban universities that have engaged in, to a significant degree, in real estate purchases, gentrification, and transforming and revitalizing cities that were in decline, including Arizona State and Phoenix, the University of Chicago in Chicago, NYU and Columbia, New York, and Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. So this is one body of concerns, the question of the connection between the university and the political economy. A second body of concerns has to do specifically with the university as employer and faculty and students and staff as employees. And this raises a whole variety of concerns about pay levels, job security, adjunctification. Nowadays, about 70% of all college courses are taught by adjuncts, many of whom are paid by the course, low pay, limited or no job security, fearful of going beyond the bounds of accepted curricula and so on. And at the same time, there's lots of data to suggest that there's been an increase in the number of administrators in higher education and in the salaries of administrators. So there's a whole body of concern that we have with the idea of the university as a place, as a site for work. The third body of concerns we have has to do with really the title of this webinar, the educational content of higher education, STEM versus humanities, the use of metrics to evaluate performance, challenges and restriction on what we might call critical studies, that is, threats to women's and gender studies, African American studies, peace studies, interdisciplinary programs, and in addition, in reference to the Iowa case and state legislative action that I referred to earlier, efforts to either ban certain kind of subject matter from the curricula, or in the case again of Purdue University, to sanitize the curricula, to require a civic literacy course or experience that all Purdue students would take. And in the case of Purdue, to sort of remodel the liberal arts side of the campus that Dan will talk about into a new kind of narrow program called Cornerstone at the expense of academic departments. So that this third general issue perhaps is the one that interests us most or concerns us the most. And it concerns us because I think it's getting at some of the issues raised by Nancy McLean and David Schweikert. That is to say, these changes are about ideological contestation, the transformation of consciousness, the reestablishment of the legitimacy of dominant paradigms preferred by the ruling class, And here one could look at some interesting quotes from Gramsci. Ideologies are anything but arbitrary. They are real historical facts which must be combated, and their nature as instruments, if domination revealed, not for reasons of morality, but for reasons of political struggle, in order to make the governed intellectually independent of the governing, in order to destroy one hegemony and create another. And as you know, Gramsci referred to the concept of cultural hegemony, the idea that the dominant ideology of society, the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and morals should reflect those of the ruling class. And the dominant ideology justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural, inevitable, perpetual, and beneficial for everyone. And just for a moment to give a dime store history of higher education, I think to underscore this last point about ideological hegemony, I begin with the propositions that universities have always served ruling classes. In the pre-modern period, theological elites. In the period of the Industrial Revolution, universities were designed to service and preserve and legitimize industrial capitalism and later finance capitalism, and in recent times, military and foreign policy. I like the Galileo metaphor. I don't know if this is true, but one sociologist in a presentation referred to the fact that Galileo was punished not for his scientific findings about the Earth going around the sun, but that he communicated those findings in the vernacular of the people at large. He was linking up his scientific research with the people at large rather than preserving it in the context of, or the milieu of the ruling class. If we look briefly and superficially at some history of the modern university, we could begin, of course, at many places. But Charles Eliot, president of Harvard University in the latter part of the 19th century, wrote a program proposal that led to the establishment of the modern university, established departments and programs, established departments and curricula that serve to help train the people who will be the managers of corporations and the people who will work in the corporations and on the factory floors. And in a sense, we could say that this Harvard model, first established in the elite universities and then network and spread all across the nation, served as the model of higher education from the dawn of the 20th century until after World War II. In the 1940s and 50s, those who were suggesting a different kind of narrative and different kind of ideological perspective were challenged and purged. And Ellen Schrecker does a wonderful job in her book, No Ivory Tower, about the Red Scares in higher education. During the Cold War and during and after the Red Scares, you have Clark Kerr developing the concept of the multiversity. And that tradition, I suspect, continues to this day. And Dan will talk about Michael Crow and Purdue University's Mitch Daniels. But what I want to argue here, and I think is important to at least my thesis, is that we began to see in the 1960s rumblings of discontent among students who increasingly were skeptical about the narratives they were being taught in their classrooms in the liberal arts and the privileging of STEM courses in the sciences and engineering. There was discontent that also serviced as a result of the sort of top-down character of the educational process. So what one begins to see in the 60s is an explosion of student activism, obviously at places like the University of California in Berkeley, and several places around the country, and even at our own Purdue University in central Indiana. And I like the metaphor that Richard Edwards coins for a labor study that he did, that the shop floor, and in this case, higher education, became contested terrain. And the contestation of ideas made for a new vitality in higher education. And many of us on this call were young people, were students in the age of contested terrain. And my argument is that contested terrain led to the emergence of these various critical studies programs, led to revisiting American history, led to a reconsideration of the centrality of white racism and exploitation of workers and marginalization of women and environmental despoliation, such that the university continued in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, perhaps, as contested terrain, where the diversity of ideas and debates about the American experience, past, present, and the possibilities for the future would occur. At the same time, there were those who were concerned about these new interventions at the level of the university. I think David mentioned the Powell Memorandum. Powell concerned about the delegitimization of capitalism. You see the emergence in the 1970s of ALEC, the spread of Koch Foundation money, the state policy networks, the American Council of Trustees and alumni, David Horowitz and others, all engaged in the process, not only of covertly trying to transform all institutions and policies in the direction of neoliberalism and economic liberalization, but also to transform the ideas that people were engaged in discussing in K through 12 and in higher education. I think David mentioned a student group that is pretty vibrant today, Turning Point USA, and I looked at their website, and Koch brothers money is involved in stimulating young people to challenge, quote, socialism on college campuses. So my argument is that today, this whole experience of transformation of higher education is involved ideologically in a struggle to, if you will, to reverse the contested terrain, the spirit of intellectual diversity that was inspired by the 1960s and 1970s. So during periods of controversy and conflict in American society at large, universities too become contested terrain. That is, external pressures on universities lead administrators to act in ways to stifle controversy and dissent. The targets of that dissent and its supporters and students and colleagues at large raise their voices to protest efforts to squelch it. These are some of the Purdue examples and stories that maybe Dan will talk about in part. In conclusion, from my point of view, the model of the university as contested terrain is a communal one, involving teachers, students, and various communities in the ongoing collective struggle to better understand the world and to conceptualize ways to engage in it. In a very profound sense, attacks on universities from within and without are attacks on democracy. And for this reason, the university as contested terrain must be defended. And the final point that I think was suggested by the McLean-Schweikert presentation last week, the attacks on public educational institutions are a microcosm of attacks on virtually all public institutions. Now Dan will sort of concretize this in reference to the Purdue example and the literature that gives voice to this so-called new university movement. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank Harry, for that background, and also point out that if last week's webinar and this week's fit so well together, it is because Harry was the one who designed them both. Okay, now on to Dan.
Thanks. And I understand, Patricia, you have to go teach. I really appreciate that you're here and connecting with you. So thank you very much. Yeah, so, I'm going to do the dullest thing imaginable, which is just read this paper that I've been kind of working on up until the last few minutes, and I'm still editing it as we're going here. Harry touched on a lot of the points already, but this will just give a little more kind of microscopic view to maybe enhance some of the comments he made already. So just stay with me. I'll do as much as I can here. Hopefully this won't take too long. So in designing the New American University, which is a 2015 book, Michael Crow and William DeBars regard pragmatism, scale, anti-elitism, collaboration, and a rejection of a follow the leader mindset that encourages lower ranked institutions to imitate leading institutions, Harvard among the privates, Berkeley among the publics, as key motivational aspects of the New American University movement. Crow and DeBars regard the pragmatist philosophy as relevant to the NAU, that's this National American University movement, in the present context, because pragmatists insist, as Louis Menard states, that ideas and beliefs are always in the service of interests. Besides associating NAU values with a critique of disinterestedness, Crow and DeBars emphasize pragmatism's, quote, concern for the practical consequences of knowledge and for its insistence that higher education be concerned, quote, with the resolution of problems. Quote, in its concern with the resolution of problems and intent that inquiry be transformational, pragmatism thus anticipated key tenets of the New American University, end quote. As is typical of Crow and DeBars' rhetoric throughout designing the New American University, the level of discourse in their discussion of the movement's pragmatist roots tends toward the general and the abstract rather than the concrete and specific. Part of the reason Crow and DeBars avoid specific recommendations for the implementation of NAUs is directly related to their pragmatism. They advocate for NAUs to embrace their specific, quote, cultural, socioeconomic, and physical setting, end quote. Crow and DeBars' combination of advocacy for social embeddedness with an abstract stylistic approach that speaks of interests and problems, but does not go into detail about who or what these interests may be or what problems need to be solved, however, opens the door for leaders of other institutions besides Crow at Arizona State to transform their universities in directions that, under cover of the pragmatic mindset that undergirds the NAU movement, have, in our judgment, failed to serve the interests of crucial stakeholders such as faculty, staff, students, and the local communities in which the university is set. Under the leadership of Mitchell E. Daniels, Purdue's president since January 2013, and the Hoosier State's former Republican governor, Indiana's land grant has taken its place as a notable representative of the New American University movement. Purdue is also a charter member of the University Innovation Alliance, one of 11 research universities that Crow and DeBars describe as, quote, a coalition of large public research universities that represents the potential inherent in collective effort to promote institutional innovation in the interest of desired social outcomes, end quote. Daniels' endorsement of designing the New American University makes plain his admiration for the NAU philosophy, quote, Michael Crow, this is Daniels, Michael Crow has been inventing the new university for years. Friends of higher education should go to school on his innovations with this book as their textbook, end quote. In our view, Daniels' reading of Crow and DeBars is, to use the language of pragmatism, a motivated, not disinterested reading of the NAU textbook. When we describe Daniels's reading of Crow and DeBars as motivated, we refer to our observation that the version of the new American university that is taking shape at Purdue under Daniels's presidency diverges in design and practice from the general contours of the NAU, as Crow and DeBars imagine it in their 2015 manifesto. In their chapter on, quote, a pragmatic approach to innovation and sustainability, Crow and DeBars rehearse arguments by the contemporary social philosopher Jürgen Habermas concerning, quote, communicative action. Following Charles Sanders Peirce's theory of knowledge and truth, Crow and DeBars argue that, quote, communicative action focuses on reaching, quote, a consensus position generated through discourse between many observers, end quote. Throughout the pragmatism chapter, Crow and DeBars press hard on the values of, quote, intersubjective agreement, dialogue, and, quote, myriad groups discussing and negotiating different realities, end quote, as crucial aspects of the new American university. Perhaps here echoing Clayton Christensen's call for the application of a, quote, disruptive innovation corporate business model into the context of higher education to protect the academy from what Jeffrey West in his book Scale calls the, quote, stagnation of a geriatric IBM or General Motors, end quote. Crow and DeBars, under the cover of iconic liberal thinkers such as John Dewey and Habermas, argue that higher education should reflect a commitment to the, quote, pragmatist refusal to acquiesce to tradition or cede authority beyond an appeal to relevant communities of inquiry, end quote. Crow and DeBars, for example, emphasize pragmatist educational theorist Dewey's affirmation of, quote, public discussion and debate as crucial dimensions of democratic cultures, and thus as linchpins of a new American university that works in the public interest by engaging, quote, the public reasonably, fairly, with dialogue and responsibly in a timely manner, and which would be, quote, committed to the public interest, evincing neutrality, openness, and justice, end quote. As the new American university model takes shape at Purdue, President Daniels has degraded a pragmatist legacy of shared governance, public transparency, and genuine negotiation of differences between stakeholders who hold different views about the meaning and purpose of Indiana's land-grant university. From the Purdue trustees' decision in June 2021 to implement a controversial civics literacy requirement in the face of a lopsided vote against approving of the requirement by the university Senate, and in the face of a vociferous protest from AAUP membership, to its unwillingness to provide open forums prior to moving forward on such transformational programs as the rebranding of the private for-profit Kaplan University as the public Purdue Global in 2018. And also in 2018, it's in the end failed bid to partner with the Bechtel Corporation to secure a $2 billion federal contract to manage the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, to such comparatively modest, but nonetheless significant decisions as last summer's selling of the century-old university radio station, WBAA, Indiana's oldest, and a trusted local source of news and beloved purveyor of offbeat cultural programming that caters to the eclectic tastes of a diverse university community, to the private Goltzer investment management team of Indianapolis. And as the student-run Purdue Exponent reported in a May 6th, 2021 edition, quote, the university's partnership with a for-profit company, Purdue Aviation LLC, half owned by a high-profile donor named Scott M. Niswanger, that has led many faculty and alumni to fear that, quote, to further privatize the university's flight training program would also make way for lowered safety standards in an effort to maximize profits. Purdue has dishonored the pragmatist Deweyan tenet of public discussion and debate to engage with, quote, the public reasonably, fairly, with dialogue and responsibly in a timely manner, and which would be committed to the public interest, all linchpins of Crow's New American University project. Crow's New American University model, as it is playing out at Purdue, has upset university's moral compass and raises questions about the relationship between ethics and higher education in the wake of the rise of neoliberalism in the higher education space. Further, Purdue's version of the new American university under Daniels and what Crow and DeBars in a 2020 follow-up book on the same topic refer to as the fifth wave of the evolution of American higher education raises questions, and this gets back to what Harry was talking about, raises questions about whether the new American university model can tolerate a vision of higher education as a contested site of contradictory energies, competing visions of the purpose of public higher education, and divergent pedagogic impulses that range from an emphasis on the ambivalences and paradoxes associated with the qualitative analysis of literary critics and political theorists to the cut and dried quantitative approach of data analysts. Collectively, Harry and I share a significant degree of institutional memory, having collectively served on the Purdue faculty for about 80 years. Often frustrating, sometimes infuriating, but always engaging of our critical attention and creative commentary, I think Harry would agree with me that higher education as a contested site did exist at Purdue for much of our careers here at an engineering, agriculture, business-oriented university located in a semi-rural part of the traditionally conservative state of Indiana. Not so much anymore. The new American university model at Purdue under Daniels may be characterized by an appropriation of the rhetoric of the left in areas such as open admissions, free speech, diversity of thought, and a misrepresentation for entrepreneurial purposes of the cherished promises of working class access to higher education through the Morrill Act that Lincoln signed in 1862 to usher in the land-grant college movement. A university whose nickname, the Boilermakers, may be associated with poesis or making, as in a recent Makers All promotional campaign, Purdue, as we will demonstrate below, now specializes in image production and semantic manipulation by playing with the meanings of key terms associated with a sympathetic social contract, but subverting these key terms for reasons often irrational that we argue are in part motivated, as Harry has noted, by rightist resentments about left-leaning post-60s faculty's control over academe. Let me just go into a couple of the points, and I realize I've talked a lot here, but I want to kind of get into some details. As a front page story in a recent edition of the Washington Post demonstrates, Purdue is spending a fortune on marketing of the Boilermaker brand. In some ways, Purdue's extraordinary focus on image management is paying off. Forbes magazine recently ranked Purdue highly in its list of top universities based on vocational value measures. US News and World Report ranks Purdue in the top 10 of innovative universities. ASU is number 1. And most recently, as Purdue's online news outlet boasts in an October 26, 21 report, Purdue is the only university in Fast Company magazine's inaugural list of brands that matter. In the story, President Daniels comments, "This latest recognition belongs to the entire community, and we're grateful that Fast Company has singled out Purdue University of a high value. You can't have a great brand without a great product, and our marketing team has worked hard to tell the world what this university stands for and how our faculty, staff, and students impact lives." Daniels is unusually candid when he cites the hard work of our marketing team, but he doesn't report, as does the Washington Post, on the extraordinary degree to which Purdue, ironically branded as a value-oriented, no-frills, meat and potatoes vocational technical institution, has invested heavily in marketing and image management in the new American university era. The Washington Post story focusing on Purdue's profligate spending on marketing fits into our overall analysis that Daniels is following the playbook of ASU's Michael Crow. The story shows that ASU and Purdue are the two featured, quote, innovators who have turned to the private sector. Outback Steakhouse for ASU, Lilly, no surprise there for Purdue, given that Mitch Daniels, as Wikipedia reports, served as president of Lilly's North American operations and then as senior vice president for corporate strategy and policy for their chief marketing officer talent. Following the Washington Post story, we note how closely are the ASU and Purdue brand slogans. ASU, innovation drives us forward. Purdue, persistent innovation together, as well as the massive size of Purdue's marketing staff, which, according to the article, must be among the, if not the largest in the country. The article notes that typical robust university marketing staffs average between 9 and 24 employees, but Purdue has a staff of 65 dedicated marketing employees, plus the Purdue marketing officer notes in the story, around 250 other employees around campus involved with marketing. By the Purdue marketing officer's own estimate then, Purdue employs well over 300 people to do marketing and branding. Salaries for chief marketing officers are 3 to 4 times the salary of a tenure-track professor, and so Purdue is very likely spending as much or more on marketing staff salaries than on major academic units. It is, in our judgment, a fair assessment to assert that Purdue ASU have indeed been master innovators as they reimagine higher education in a new neoliberal era. But that innovation has little to do with the much vaunted focus on efficiency, eliminating what they perceive as wasteful spending, or even using technology to enhance educational performance. Rather, Crow and Daniels have shifted the focus of higher education evaluation from a reality-based model, what work is actually done and what are the outcomes of the work, and what does that mean in terms of social progress, and towards an illusion-based model. Harry likes to compare it to the metaphor of the fog machine from Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that, as in postmodern theory, shifts the emphasis towards superstructural image management, appearance, not reality. It is a rich irony that Purdue, so long associated, as does Daniels, with terms such as grit and finding real-world solutions to real-world problems, because we are makers all, is in fact ushering into higher education the emphasis on image, marketing, and branding that, as the article states, will make higher education marketing look like it looks at GE. And I should add that GE, of course, was just in the news because the company has basically dissolved and been broken up into 3 different pieces, with I think just one piece remaining as GE. So not exactly the model we want. Let me just, there's a lot to cover here, and I realize I'm taking a lot of time. Let me just look at the way that Michael Crow talks about Purdue Global, and then kind of stop there, and I'll leave out some of the other stuff I was going to talk about. So just another 3-4 minutes. In his most recent manifesto, this is from the 2020 book called The Fifth Wave, on transformational higher education, Michael Crow argues that the fifth wave will apply 5 design operations, quote, economy of scale, 2, lean operations, 3, financial engineering for accessibility, 4, networked operations, and 5, technologically intensive operations. According to Crow, the fifth wave university can, quote, transcend the conflict between accessibility and excellence, strongly favoring a radical movement away from selective admissions for undergraduates at major research universities, in part through a reliance on, quote, advancing the design and scalable delivery of digital education and incorporating adaptive learning methodologies to, quote, personalize the online experience for potentially tens and hundreds of thousands of students, end quote. Crow argues that because, quote, adaptive learning and artificial intelligence technologies have turned online learning into a fully personalized experience that tracks the pace of individual students, end quote, the fifth wave research university, quote, will reconcile the demands of accessibility with the potential of world-class knowledge production and innovation, quote. Scale and quality are no longer in conflict in Crow's imagination of an automated fifth wave mega university. Purdue's acquisition and rebranding of Kaplan University as Purdue University Global in 2018 is, in Crow's words, a signature example of how an established, quote, fourth wave institution such as Purdue has taken an exemplary step in the direction of the fifth wave. Here is some of what Crow has to say about why, in his opinion, through this technologically enabled strategy and the formation of Purdue University Global, Purdue consolidates its position as one of the leading national land-grant university members institutions heralding the fifth wave. Quote, he says, After many false starts by some of the most prestigious universities in the world, information and communication technologies now allow fifth wave universities to offer personalized, interactive online education that is comparable to that delivered on traditional immersion campus. Through its acquisition of Kaplan and the formation of Purdue Global, Purdue University is filling an important niche in a changing environment. Purdue will continue to offer top-tier research-grade immersion at its historic flagship campus in West Lafayette, but the acquisition of Kaplan demonstrates that fourth-wave universities can transcend the status quo to deliver flexible educational opportunities at a scale requisite to societal need. To get a fix on the image reality issue with Purdue Global, I contacted David Sanders, a Purdue University biology professor who signed up for a Purdue Global course and attended it to see for himself if Crow's claim that Purdue Global is indeed an example of how fifth wave universities can offer personalized, interactive online education that is comparable to that delivered on traditional emerging campus. Of his experience of Purdue Global, Sanders writes, it was in essence, here are some not college level sources. Regurgitate what you read. Do not dare to bring in any other sources when you write papers. It reminded me of my elementary school American history class, end quote. I'll just jump down just to the very end here. I'll read just one more paragraph. We would argue that strengthening and supporting the existing public higher education statewide network that Indiana already enjoys, Ivy Tech, which is the community college system, various Purdue and IU satellite campuses in Kokomo, Fort Wayne, Richmond, Indiana, North Central Indiana, for example, as well as established regional state public campuses such as Ball State, Indiana State, IUPUI, and the University of Southern Indiana in Evansville, are already situated to provide robust learning opportunities for pretty much every corner of the state. It is a false populist argument, more branding and image management, when Mitch Daniels associates Purdue Global with the land grant mission by claiming Purdue Global offers access, say, to single parent working mothers and military veterans that would be unavailable were it not for Purdue Global's ubiquitous reach. Existing community college and most public state higher educational institutions already have remote learning options, as well as campuses that are conveniently located in virtually every town and city in the Hoosier state. The rebranding of Kaplan as Purdue Global must be about something else than furthering the land grant mission of providing access to quality public education to underserved populations. All right, I'll leave out some of the other stuff, but that's what I'll do right there. All right, thanks, guys. That's all. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you, Dan and Harry. And now we can take questions and comments from the floor. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can get your questions to us by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Just put in the subject line the word question so I can easily identify them. And I'll pass your message on to those in the Zoom room. Those who are with us in the Zoom room, of course, can ask your questions more directly. And so let me open the floor to those who want to enter the discussion at this point. Okay, I see David Schweikert.
Okay, well, it's very interesting, both of you. What I was thinking about the whole time, though, is how does, the civics education, Purdue Global, and so on, does that tie in any way with this worry about students becoming too political and being turned into socialists and all of that, which is, one of the things I was emphasizing, of course, in my own talk. Are they connected, or are those sort of two basically different phenomena? mean, the branding you can see, that's how to make a lot of money. That's good old capitalism. But is there concern about this student activism and so on and so forth?
Well, one point I would just make, and Harry had mentioned, and I ended up not talking about this, but the shift in the liberal arts toward this program called Cornerstone program, which is really the major direction of the liberal arts now at Purdue, is a kind of a replacement of the English department controlled first-year writing program, which from the point of view of the administration was too much of a critical theory, critical thinking, social critique-oriented program having to do with, say, subject positions of writers, issues around audience, bringing up issues around gender, sexuality, perspectives on writing, really kind of cutting-edge approaches to rhetoric. And replacing that program with a program now in the control of the dean's office that really does go back to that 1980s playbook that Harry was talking about, people like Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, and who was the guy who was from Texas, who talked about that there was certain knowledge that individuals were supposed to, I think he was the head of the education program, I can't think of his name right now, that there was sort of common knowledge that all persons should have, all citizens should have. William Bennett. What's happening is that with this Mitch Daniels and his handpicked dean, have decided to kind of insert that kind of 80s culture war into the teaching of writing, communication, and literature at Purdue by taking the writing program away from the English department and coupling it with this kind of great books initiative in which the teachers have to teach certain numbers of classics and then also the basic writing skills. And so this is, and then as what Harry was mentioning, cutting the English department, for example, with no hiring in 13 years and no hiring predicted until the year 2030, when the department gets down to maybe about 20 members. It had been about 60 when I got here. And the kind of shuttering or combining of a lot of the kind of critical programs, peace studies, American studies, gender studies, African American studies, it all kind of combines to reduce, I think, the opportunities for Purdue students to be mentored and to engage in critical thinking in ways that the university leadership now found to be too uncomfortable. And I think the civics literacy requirement is very serious, very similar. When last year, I'll just make the point, Purdue, kind of to give lip service to the Black Lives Matter movement, began an equity, inclusivity, diversity lecture series. And the closing speaker was Shelby Steele, who spent the whole session trashing the whole idea of equity, inclusivity, diversity, affirmative action. I mean, it was just such a good example of how Purdue will create a program, to apparently show some support to current concerns, but then just rip the rug right out from under it. And the civics literacy requirement works in the exact same way, because it's this idea that, yeah, you might be getting some of these liberal professors who are going to be kind of telling you this and that about history or American culture or literature, but in the end, you have to pass this test that shows a kind of literal allegiance to American values and a kind of a narrative of American ascent toward justice for all. I mean, in another paper, I talk about this where Mitch Daniels was interviewed about the civics literacy. And he said it's to get people to acknowledge the fact that America, for its few faults, is basically a good and great country moving in the direction of justice and freedom. And that's kind of what to get your degree at Purdue, it's like one of these tests from the 1950s, loyalty oath. That's pretty much what it serves. So it's very much of a control of the discourse and of the possibility for any critique or alternative viewpoints. That's why, I mean, what I did say, and I really feel that, Purdue has never been an easy place to be as a liberal, progressive, humanities person, but there was that space for contest and critique, and it could be a kind of exciting place to be at times. And I feel like that's really what's being, they're taking the air out of that with all of these different measures that we're noting.
Yeah, can I just add to what Dan had said? I have 4 items. First, the civic literacy. I began to ask the question, what is this civic literacy about?
Yeah.
And I found a 2015 report prepared by ACTA, and I won't even try to, David would know what the initials stand for, but it's a Koch brothers front for higher education, which has given awards to Mitch Daniels and others. And ACTA prepared a report on civic literacy. And the preface to that report by a historian from New York said that what civic literacy is about is to teach students about the vibrancy of American political institutions and our resilience and the institution's ability to overcome challenges and problems. And I would bet subsequent to that, the civic literacy idea sort of overflowed among liberals as well as conservatives. But the basic idea of civic literacy is to give to provide education that privileges and gives legitimacy to American history, and to explain white supremacy and racism as really anomalies. So that has its roots, I think, in the Koch brothers' efforts to transform higher education, and again, to reverse the 1960s. Secondly, Mitch Daniels has embraced the so-called Chicago principles. And the Chicago principles was a celebration of academic freedom. And I think the conservatives have a wonderful way of taking our concepts and using them for their own purposes, so that the Chicago principles are designed to sort of diminish the vibrancy of discussion and debate on Purdue's campus and in campuses around the country about racism, sexism, the environmental crisis, and so on. Third, Mitch Daniels sponsors an ongoing series, presidential lecture series, and Dan might recall some of the speakers who I forget, but we recently had at Purdue Professor Kunin, who essentially is a climate denier, and that generated a statement from AEUP. J.D. Vance is another former speaker, Hillbilly Elegy. Among the left wing of Mitch Daniels's presidential lecturers was George Will. Condoleezza Rice has been a guest speaker, and so on. So he uses these presidential lectures as a way to communicate a kind of unidimensional ideological perspective. And last, and I throw this out as much as a question for those of you who do philosophy of science as to the last word on the subject. I am interested modestly as a rank amateur in pedagogy and methodology. And I, a long time ago, became impressed with dialectical and historical materialism, a kind of perspective, as I understand it, that looks to complexity, contradiction in both human and social phenomena and physical and biological phenomena. What's being privileged at Purdue, but not just at Purdue, is so-called data science. And my gut feeling tells me, as a true amateur in philosophy of science, and maybe several of you could help me out, is that the data science movement is designed to reduce what we mean by knowledge by the aggregation of large pools of data. I saw a summary of a study just last week by a political scientist that has to do with the connection between whether a state is red and blue and skepticism about the seriousness of COVID, okay? And what the person did was to look at Google data over over a long period of time, and to use that data as foundational knowledge to then develop and test his hypotheses. So in other words, history is being removed from the study of social, political, and physical phenomena. And at Purdue University, there are programs in data science now. There's fellowships for people doing research on data science. And my hunch is, as a truly amateur philosopher of science, is that this phenomena occurring in higher education is potentially transformational about what we know, how we know what we know, how we study reality, and therefore what we can do about changing reality. So, and so ultimately, I think, David, I think there's an inextricable connection between economic interest, profit, and universities are profit-making corporations, and the ideological justification for what these universities are doing.
I saw James Palumbo's hand, so let me call on him next. Hi, James. Unmute yourself.
Are we there?
Yes.
Okay. Nice to see you again, Cliff, and some good information coming from the professors, Targ and Morris. Good stuff. I'm curious how you sort of interpret this. By the way, I sent you both an email with the declaration for clarity on ideological clarity. Hopefully you guys might get that. But in that context, I keep thinking about a group of students sitting before you, and perhaps with Michael Crow, who I've had some conversations with, and that group of students wondering, why are these guys having the debate that they're having, given that they seem to be saying the same things? Civic education and in particular having an informed citizenry, etc. And I'm mentioning this because it always worries me that the public and or the student population really doesn't have a handle on how to translate what you guys are saying as opposed to what Michael Crow would be saying. And that leads me back to the ideological clarity concern. Some of this might be better couched in the context of a better understanding the America's actual ideological character. Capitalism and democracy being put on the table in their definitions, and looking at social problems accordingly, and giving the student population and the public a chance to think for themselves, how does capitalism and democracy play out in my everyday life, and play out in my voting choices, and play out in the context of what you guys are saying and in the context of what Michael Crow's saying. And so I guess I'm just suggesting that we spend some time in the immediate future talking more about how to develop this nonpartisan civic education, informed citizenry concept, so people can sort through what's being put on our collective table. So I'm hoping that makes some sense, but that's what I wanted to say. So I appreciate the moment to say that.
Thank you. One thing, and I didn't get to this, I sort of had a second half of my paper. Michael Crow spoke at I believe it was an ALEC event where Mitch Daniels was in the audience, and he said, the big revolution is that the faculty used to think the university was about them, and that's not the case anymore. It's about the students. And everyone cheered, and Mitch Daniels clapped in the audience. So, what I wanted to kind of talk about in this paper, and I guess I didn't really get enough to it, was what is the student experience? How is this new American university model, the mega university, the idea that you could just have, like, Purdue this year, again, it's coming out of the Crow playbook, has the largest incoming class in Purdue history, well over 10,000 students first year, and it's the largest in the Big Ten this year. I mean, and that includes big schools like Ohio State. So this idea that sort of quality and quantity don't you can kind of have it all, if you just use technology and efficiencies and these other points. But then, I have a list coming from the student newspaper, even the local newspaper, and even large national venues like the New York Times that have started to notice at Purdue the crises that students are facing in terms of their safety, in terms of their well-being, and in terms of their success in this new model. So, for example, just to quote a few things, there was a recent New York Times story that featured Purdue associating the rise of off-campus private housing developments at college campuses as itself a source of mismanagement, danger, and corruption. Quote, sometimes the hallways are dark, said Ashley Kubaki, 22, a senior at Purdue University who pays $965 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in the Fairway housing complex just off campus. Quote, it is pitch black and it can be scary. Sometimes someone could get hurt. So that's this, what does it mean when you kind of privatize the housing? There was another story in the local newspaper that again around housing, that the dorms were now being cut up so that dorms that were made for 2 were now going to have 4 students in them. Hallways now had these, they were setting up little cubicles, if you would, in the hallways for students to live in open spaces in the hallways. But then there was an email that I got from the vice provost for student outcomes. Almost 2,000 students are on academic probation right now. And so what the person, the email said is that that our job is to remind students that we have to humanize the experience of academia, and that we want students to know that we care about them. Well, this has to do with this sort of increased class size, movement toward, AI learning, not properly funding the faculty, the staffing, the kind of infrastructure and needs of students, so that, a large swath of the student population is on academic probation. So when you start to look at it like that, I mean, the student experience, there were other quotes under an article in the school newspaper, campus crowding. Let me just make this one point. Police altercations are increasing with students. Heavy bicycle traffic is creating safety issues on campus. I mean, in almost every aspect of the student experience, this model is, again, under cover of of public education, access, diversity of thought, all these kinds of things. But really, this economic model is really hurting these students. And even with that, I'll just bring up one other statistic I saw: 6,247 students have tested positive of COVID at Purdue since the crisis began. And so the idea of cramming these students together, in these spaces and the open, having Purdue stay open, when others were saying that wasn't a good idea, not having the vaccination requirements in a state that has very low adherence, to vaccination. It's literally endangering the mental safety, the health and welfare, and the success of these students. So I mean, I think
I just got to say this, and I don't mean to, I don't want to absorb any more time than necessary, but I can't help, and I everything you said I agree with, and I mean, I'm a criminologist by trade, and the problems in the criminal justice system mirror a lot of the kinds of things that you're talking about. The problem I'm having is that I hear you speaking from your side. And that's part of the problem, because we're having these sides presented with all their information, and it's left students and the public to think, wow, there's some of this makes sense on both sides, and the information is there, the data there to support your position, and the data to support Michael Crow's position is there. And it gets into this conflict, and I'm wondering, is there a better way to do this rather than making it a conflict situation? Is there a better way to say, look, we're going to present all sides. Dan Morris is going to be here, and Michael Crow is going to be here, and we're going to put this in the setting of how can you understand the American experiment better? And if you give the essentials in a civic education process, then people can begin to attach to what you're saying and what Michael Crow's saying and what a liberal says and what a conservative said, what a progressive says, etc., and start to make informed decisions for themselves rather than presenting it saying, this is what you should be looking at. Look at our side.
Right.
And I think we need to do that. I've been at this for 5 decades now, going on 6. And it's a tough road, but we're at a point where these discussions like we're now participating in, and my hat's off to you, Cliff, you're always trying your best. These kinds of discussions are what needs to be brought to the civic education, informed citizenry table, and saying, okay, public, students, etc., we need your help here in sorting through this so we can have a better country. We are a capitalist country. We hold to the principles of democracy, and that makes us very particular. And so we have to own up to our ideological character. And the rest of the world looks at us and thinks, man, you guys are really behind the 8 ball. You're always talking about democracy and democracy. That's not what you do. Every day, every day, the decisions that are made by every citizen are market decisions. You're a capitalist country. I had a woman in Manama at a rooftop party when I lived in the Middle East for a while. She just caught me off guard saying, you don't have a division of church and state. Your religion is capitalism. You bow to it. You pray to it. And those kinds of things, the rest of the world sees us like that. So if we own up to our ideological character and begin to understand who we are, then we can understand your point better, Michael Crow's point better, and let the public decide. I'll leave it there because we can go on forever.
That's great.
Harry's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I only wanted to respond to part of what James is suggesting, and it's my classroom experience, both the experience and my desire, even if it was not achievable. One, I tried to create an environment in which students believed and were enthusiastic about a collective effort in pursuing truth. This meant discussion. This meant small size classes. This meant openness. This meant introducing for students, if they're not aware of it, of diverse points of view, my point of view and other points of view. I sort of appreciate Paulo Freire's thinking about the experience that students bring to the table. I appreciate Gramsci's idea about the connection between so-called intellectuals and people in the community. And if anything, what I'm arguing for is an impulse that many of us had in the 1960s to increase diversity, debate, inclusion of different points of view, and seeing if there are cases where consensus could be achieved out of conflict. I think our argument is that the Daniels, Crow, even Kerr model is the opposite of this, that institutions have been created that are non-transparent, non-participatory. And I forgot to mention something I was going to mention at the outset of this talk. J.D. Vance, who spoke, I think, election night, he's going to be the Republican candidate from Ohio. And he said, I want to remember some wise words from former President Nixon. Professors are the enemy. So, you know, I don't know if this is addressing the kind of concerns that James is, but I think Dan and I are interested in a university environment where diversity, debate can occur. And that has to do with size and curriculum and freedom of faculty and respect for students, and trying to figure out ways to link the larger communities in which we operate with the university community.
James has his, James, put your mute on, I think. James, see if you put your mute on to stop that noise.
Okay. Norma Harrison has had her hand up for some time. So call on you now.
James, can you hear me? James Palumbo. The noise is coming from your connection. Can you put your, there you go. Hello. Nice to see everybody. Does everybody know that the AS, can you leave your mute on, James? There you go. Does everybody know that ASU is teaching? Somebody has control of your computer or something. It's teaching how to mine bodies in outer space. Does everybody know that? It's a big thing. What Crow has done is he started out collecting, for one thing, profits on intellectual property, right? And turning those into the school to amplify its attraction to everybody else. And it's been very successful to make sure that everybody is getting funded to do what is elaborate language. What is his language? Self-laudatory language. It just goes on and on and on about how they're wonderful and they're doing all this, that, and the other. And they're paying to make those statements actionable so that the students are supported through whatever the effort is that they stipulate that they're trying to achieve. None of which, well, on the overall, it's not educational. I put a note in the chat about my writing called School is the Opposite of Education, which talks about the alienation of our living as facilitated by school. So I asked people instead to see if you can envision, as I have long been doing, that children who are wrenched from their families at 6 months old, so the mother can go out to work and make a little bit more than she has to pay the babysitter. The parent has to pay the babysitter. And they're taken away from their family. This is the basic alienation. This means that the children and the families have not gotten together to be nice to each other, to protect and further each other's whatever human being thing that's going on. And I used to get them in I did various things. I was substitute teaching here in California. I didn't have a fifth year. I studied in Chicago where it wasn't required, so I could never have a position here in California because I couldn't afford to take the time off from working and to pay for the schooling. So I didn't know about, I did know about loan. Yeah.
Norma, so what is your question?
I have no questions, Cliff.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I've been trying to recite a number of answers. People have been going on here at length with unrelated in a way. I mean, they've acknowledged what the direction of what the direction takes us here, but it hasn't gone. So I'm offering if you can think of that children stay among their community, among their family, that they participate in whatever the work is that people find they need to do, which is not what the opportunity is now. That people get away from the idea of an 8-hour day. This is not what life is. Life is about that we do things, pretend every day is Saturday. Well, should I do this? Well, maybe not, and that the children participate. Yeah, they might decide that they want to tell the children, this is how you read and this is how you write. But I learned how to read because my mother read to me a lot, and I used to read the stories back eventually, and I could read when I was about 4. An integrated kind of living instead of this segregationist, separatist getting together. Can you see it? And if you commit to it, you can answer all your questions. You can say, you can answer all your questions if you say that we should not have a forced, what do they call it? Compulsory free education. I love that. That was a 14-year-old girl said that we have compulsory free education. That's the point. The compulsory, and I'm afraid that that's the kind of thing that's going to bring down Cuba too, is that children are going to say, I don't want to be compelled to go do this. That it's not something that's coming from the individual. It's being imposed as a kindness kind of relationship. You're being told that this is kindness for you, for your community, and we're going to make you do it. And to a degree, I am in favor of a totalitarian approach to participation.
We're running out of time, and there is one question that we do need to get in before we end. Our speakers have talked about the many reasons why students have cause to be dissatisfied with the kind of university that is being created, and to prevent them from rebelling against it. A kind of civics education is being promoted that instills in them an ideology of conformity and acceptance. Okay, so that's with the students. But how about the faculty side? The faculty have lots of reason to be discontented too. And what are they doing? And how is it that the administrations are preventing them?
Just one answer, and then I'll defer to Dan. I like Robert Reich's recent metaphor that labor around the country is engaged in a general strike, and that may be a problematic formulation of the labor unrest that's occurring in the service sector, in hospitals, and in K through 12 teaching. There is also a burgeoning movement of faculty. The American Association of University Professors has grown. It was dormant for many years at Purdue University, and it's grown. And we're part of a statewide AUP network, and there's a Midwest network of AUP. I mentioned at the outset the president of University of Florida's efforts to stifle election experts from publicly testifying. The state of Florida has a faculty union that's some kind of a coalescence of AFT and AUP, and they made a public issue of the president of Florida University's directive, and he had to reverse it. So I think there's a burgeoning organization at the level of the faculty as well. There are various adjunct faculty movements emerging around the country. TAs and graduate students are organizing. Some campuses like University of Pittsburgh have voted to unionize the faculty. So there's movement in a variety of ways. I would like to see more movement of student activism on campus. Young people are engaged in a whole variety of issues and organizing. DSA now has about 90,000 members. There's the Sunrise Movement. There are a whole variety of movements around issues, and I would like to see many of them come back to campus as well as their work in the community. Within the last 2 or 3 weeks, Purdue University has experienced a sort of uprising of a Me Too movement in a response to several incidences of sexual impropriety occurring in fraternity houses. So there is movement, and I think that's a terribly important question. If we don't have movement and organization, we're not going to be able to resist and reverse the trends that we've described during most of this webinar.
Dan.
Oh yeah, just briefly, great question, Cliff. And a lot of thoughts went through my mind. One of them is that conversation that I had with Harry, some years ago, where he said to me, professors really who have tenure, who have the privilege of tenure, that he wasn't so sure that those of us who do have that have used it, to to give us confidence and some degree of security to speak out. And that really stuck with me because I've been at Purdue for almost 30 years, but for probably the first 2/3 of my time at Purdue, I was just, going along in my merry way, following the script, publishing in my field, teaching my classes, doing, the things I was supposed to do for personal advancement. And I feel a sadness that that I just kind of did have my head in the sand. And I think, conversations like that, what I mentioned with Harry, where he said, this tenure, it's a meaningful thing. It saddens me, that I waited such a long time to speak out a little bit and get involved. But I don't know that there's been enough of the folks who do have this privilege of tenure to use that as a platform to be able to speak out a little bit more. And I'm not quite sure why. I think that at a place like Purdue, there is a lot of sort of separation that goes on. There's a lot of these creation of different programs and units and areas, so that we're kind of divided. And something I've written about before, which is that the newer programs that Purdue has put in place, like this Cornerstone program and the Honors College, Purdue Global, they're all exclusively non-tenure track programs in terms of the hiring and the administration and the presentation of these. So when you have, like in Purdue Global, I did a study in just the humanities area. I think they had it was close to 1,700. I don't remember the exact number of names of folks who are listed as faculty members. And, and not one of them has job security. They're just names on a list, kind of, to become kind of information providers, you might say. They have no control over their courses, working piecemeal and so forth. I mean, when you're moving into that model where, where in a Cornerstone program, for example, 80% of the courses are taught by non-tenure track faculty, it's just, and it just makes it that much more difficult to have the confidence, the wherewithal, the perspective to be able to, not perspective, but the financial ability to kind of take time to do this kind of a work. It's just the odds are really stacked against against this kind of work. But I do wish more of us got involved, and I think there is a sense of languishing. I think there's depression. I think there is just a hopelessness. I think that it's really there is a lot of challenges for people to try to collect together, because there's been a lot of kind of even within departments like my own, there'll be winners and losers. You know what I'm saying? There'll be some folks in their areas are saved, other folks whose areas are diminished, and a lot of protection of turf. I don't know. I just think that it's been hard for us to kind of communicate or even to know what the other folks are going through. So it's there's been some progressive and good signs, but there's also been strong limitations on the work that we might be able to do. I don't know, Harry, do you have any thoughts on that? The sense that it's not.
I wanted to put Cliff on the spot a little bit.
Right.
Among when we look back on the ferment of the 60s and 70s, one element was the mobilization of progressive faculty in professional associations, challenging in part the dominant paradigms in the field and who controls the journals and all of this.
Right.
And one that I found most inspiring was the Radical Philosophy Association, which even allowed some political scientists to become members. So they were pretty open. The last RPA meeting that I went to was about 3 or 4 years ago, but I was kind of impressed with the emergence of newer generations of young radical philosophers who were carrying on the tradition. The American Political Science Review, which is the preeminent journal in the field, has an editorial board now that's entirely women, maybe a third women of color. And so I have less information about the mobilization at the level of professional associations, but maybe we ought to look at those as possible sources of resistance to what we've been describing during most of this webinar. And I don't know if you have anything to say about RPA today.
Sure. The Radical Philosophy Association just completed its biennial conference online. And one of the things that was so remarkable about it, and it's too bad that you weren't able to be there, Harry, was a large number of young people addressing a variety of even more political content than has often been the case in the past. I mean, one of the tendencies that I've seen in RPA over the years is the tendency, particularly of younger members, seeking to gain tenure or to move up in the profession, to do the most abstract academic work, and not to be politically engaged. But the trend seems to be quite different now, and that is a very encouraging sign.
One quick point. One of the things that Mitch Daniels has done is publicly bash academic societies, conferences, he used the phrase it's the leisure of the theory class, taking, I guess, was it Thornton Vebleen's idea of the theory of the leisure class, and basically, I mean, in print and in online talks and so forth, saying it's just a bunch of folks who all think alike. And why do they even need tenure? Because they think alike. There's no, and it's just their chance to spend money. And in fact, spend the university money. And that's one of the areas that has been cut at Purdue, was money to go to conferences. That was one of the first things when the COVID time came, and I don't think that money has been restored. So, it's interesting that those places have become, and I'm at the Modern Language Association, have done more in these areas of activism at the very moment that the administration, like Purdue, has really limited funding for those. And you hear that a lot from graduate students. We don't have junior faculty now, but that it's almost becoming prohibitively expensive to attend conferences. I do think the Zoom online options have been very, very helpful for people, but it is interesting that those learned societies have been a target of critique. And also, I should just add, with this movement at Purdue toward general education in the humanities and liberal arts through this Cornerstone first-year program, what it's doing is despecializing, deprofessionalizing, if you would, the liberal arts and humanities faculty, so that it's really not, you don't become associated, you don't need to be associated with a learned society, a specialty, professional expertise anymore to do this kind of hodgepodge of first year basic education and communication, basic reading skills, and so forth. So the pressures really seem to be pushing down the possibility of association with these societies, both on a financial level and also in terms of the kind of hiring we're doing, which tends more to the generalist than to people who would think to connect or would be connected with specific learned societies. So it's very unfortunate, because I do think there is a lot of energy of a progressive direction in many societies today, but they're being defunded and cast out.
Can I
Now,
say,
as
can I
you-
finish
as
a
you-
sentence? Can I
as-
just finish a sentence that I started?
Okay,
I was talking about the preschool child being brought in, and the thing is that often the child would cry at the separation between themselves and the parent. This is the part of the beginning, the early stages of the reminder of the powerlessness of the individual. It starts very young. Yeah, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And they're absolutely right. They shouldn't have to be separated, especially at that tender age.
okay. As Dan was just pointing out, the pandemic has enabled us to have professional conferences on Zoom, and that has opened participation up much more widely. You no longer need university travel money to attend to a conference, and I hope that that kind of openness and the definancialization of access to to conferences will continue, and I forgot the point I was going to make off that, but
Fundraising.
we do need to end there, and I want to thank Dan Morris and Harry Targ for your very informative discussion. So hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. I thank all who contributed to the discussion. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. I hope you'll join us again next week when we will observe the closing of COP26 with an evaluation. Richard Schmidt will present an evaluation of this 26th conference. It's amazing to think they've gone on that long and still haven't produced the results that most want. But Richard Schmidt is the author of Green Capitalism, The God That Failed, and China's Engine of Environmental Collapse. I think you'll find his evaluation of the conference very interesting. And now, thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now, this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, bye.